Hello, everybody. Today we are going to look at something called the Great Migration. And the Great Migration focuses around African Americans making the decision to leave the South and to move up north. And so we're going to look at what are the reasons why they decided to. And part of your assignment is looking at push factors. And push factors are going to be factors that lead African Americans to want to leave the South. And whenever there's immigration, you're going to have push factors. And these are the things that people look at these situations and say, we want to leave. For example, the Irish potato famine, a lot of you are familiar with, that was a push factor because it made life very difficult in Ireland. And they said, if we want to survive, we need to move somewhere else. And so they moved to a lot of places like Minnesota and Wisconsin. And so we're going to look at the push factors that lead African Americans to decide to leave the South and move to the North in the 1920s and continuing on after that point as well. So here's what we have. The first push factor is going to be disenfranchisement. And disenfranchisement was the effort to prevent African Americans from having the right to vote. And that happened in a lot of different ways. That happened by putting different rules in place for voting. Sometimes it could be as simple as you had to vote in a glass jar and everybody could see how you voted. And if you voted for the side they didn't like, you possibly could be in trouble. Sometimes it involved the KKK. The Ku Klux Klan was very effective in the South at scaring African Americans. And for some, that meant when they voted, they'd get a visit by the Ku Klux Klan that night, and that could turn violent. And so disenfranchisement was a really big push factor because African Americans wanted the right to vote, just like all Americans want the right to vote. And in the South, white Southerners were really trying to prevent that from happening, which is a shame. So here's what we have. In 1867, African American men voted for the first time in the South. More than 1,500 African Americans were elected to office from 1865 to 1876. However, beginning in the late 1860s, white Southern vigilante groups, most notably the Ku Klux Klan, used violence and intimidation to prevent African Americans from voting. Poll taxes and grandfather clauses were also effectively disenfranchising freedmen and future generations of African Americans. And so what happens in the 1860s is that white Southerners see that African American votes are counting and African Americans are winning elections. And sometimes the Republican Party, which was the party of Lincoln, was winning elections in the South instead of the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party back then usually was what was running the South. And so white Southerners want to hold on to that power. And so they do whatever they can to try to prevent African Americans from voting. And sometimes it might be a poll tax, and you'd have to pay a tax in order to vote. And that prevented a lot of African Americans from voting because many were very poor. They also put in place the grandfather clause, and it said if your grandfather could not vote before 1867, you couldn't vote. Well, no African Americans could vote before 1867, so you can't vote. But how that would work through time is, say it's 1900. Well, if you couldn't vote in 1868 because your grandfather couldn't vote, then your grandchildren won't be able to vote, and the next generation. And all these things are put in place to try to prevent African Americans from voting. So a lot of African Americans say enough is enough. This isn't a place I want to live if I don't even get the right to vote. And that was one of the push factors that drove them to live in a different place. The second one is sharecropping. And sharecropping was a very, very rough way of life. So picture this, 1865, the war ends. The South has all kinds of cotton plantations. And now you have all these freed African Americans. They used to be slaves, now they're not. The only true skills that a lot of them have is in farming, specifically with cotton, because they weren't allowed to learn to read or write or anything like that. And so for a lot of African Americans, they have no money, they have no home, and they need food on the table. And so they need a job that can pay them. And the one thing they know is farming cotton. So a lot of the freed slaves go back to the plantations they originally were from or to other plantations and work picking cotton because they really don't have many other options available to them. And that was really difficult in the South. And it leads to this cycle of poverty for African Americans that you can see here. And here's how it worked. And this is one way that landowners in the South would use the system to keep African Americans basically enslaved financially. So The first one is the sharecropper, which is African Americans or poor white people as well. Sharecroppers provide land and seed. In exchange, he promises the landowner half the crop. So he'll let you live on the land. He'll let you live in one of his houses, maybe one of the slave cabins from before, and he'll give you seeds as long as you give him half the crop. And so that's what you promise you'll give him. However, you still need food because you can't eat cotton. So you go to the store of the landowner to buy food, to buy clothing, all these things. And again, you don't have any money. And so you say, all right, I'll buy these things and I will give the landowner a little bit more of my crop. So now maybe instead of owing him half the crop, maybe you owe him 3/4 the crop. You plant the seeds, you harvest the cotton, and you give the landowner the cotton crop to sell. Now you get half the earnings minus your costs, whatever your costs were. And what happens a lot of times is that because the landowner can control the price of the cotton, and because he controls the price of the goods you're buying, by the time you're done, you give him all your cotton and it's not enough money. You owe him money. So you worked hard all year, but you're in debt and you owe the landowner money, which means the next year, instead of starting off with maybe giving him half the crop, maybe the next year you have to give him 5/8 of the crop or 60, 70%. Well, now all of a sudden you have to give him more of the crop and you still need to buy the food. You still need to buy the clothing. And it's a very vicious cycle that continues and continues. And legally in some states, you could not leave that plantation if you owed money to the landowner. And so this is effectively a form of slavery. It's debt slavery. And it happened all the way up until the 1950s. And so it's really easy to say, well, African Americans gained their freedom in the 1850s. Well, that's true. They did gain their freedom in the 1850s, but the true reality behind it as well is that a lot of them until the 1950s were enslaved in this system of debt poverty. And so sharecropping became a push factor because a lot of African Americans in the South didn't want to live in the system. They wanted their kids to have a better life. And so some of them are able to get out of debt and move up north. Some of them run away from the debt to move up north and try to. Unfortunately, a lot of them can't get out of the system though. And even though the North looks like a good place to live, some still have to stay behind. But that is another push factor. This idea that maybe there's another job out there that can provide some economic freedom. So our third one is Jim Crow laws. Okay. Now, Jim Crow is the institutionalized and enforced segregation we see in the South. Segregation is you need to separate black and white people. What Jim Crow says in the South is that not only do you need to separate them, but this has to be done. You don't get a choice. So in the South, a lot of places have to be separate. You don't have that choice. Now, the idea was that you're supposed to have separate but equal. And so you have bathrooms for white people, bathrooms for black people. They're supposed to be equal. Schools for white people, schools for black people. They're supposed to be equal, That doesn't happen. As you can see here, here's the white car for white folks. Here's the car for black folks. They're not even at all. And so it becomes this joke of sorts that they're equal. By the late 1800s, Jim Crow laws were put in place to legally require separation of black and white citizens in southern states. As long as they were separate but equal, it was legal to restrict citizens' access to school, busing, restaurants, water fountains, pools, marriage, and more based on skin color. So I legally don't have the right to marry a black woman in the South under Jim Crow laws. If you're black, you can't swim in the white pool, even if it's the only pool in your school. You can't drink from the same water fountain. You can't ride in the same section of the bus. And none of this was equal. If you look at this school, does that look equal? No. Rarely were things equal. Usually services for African Americans were underfunded or non-existent. Breaking segregation laws could lead to prison sentences. And so even if you have a store and you want to allow African Americans and white people to be together, a lot of times you legally couldn't do that, or you could face a fine or go to prison. And so in the South, African Americans are looking at this and saying, no, we don't like this. In the North, maybe we have a little bit more freedom. Maybe we're treated a little bit better. And so that's a big push factor, these Jim Crow laws, because nothing they have in the South is equal, and it makes life very difficult. And so here you can see some examples. Color dining room in the rear. Men can eat in the front, White Americans key in the front, Black Americans in the South, and it leads to whole separate sections of cities. For example, you have a black jewelry store here, not because that person only wants to serve Black people, but because white and Black people are supposed to be separate. And so in Black neighborhoods, white people aren't allowed in those businesses sometimes, and the same as well for African Americans and white communities. You saw the same in some areas, specifically in the Southwest for Spanish or Mexican Americans as well. The fourth push factor are lynchings. And lynchings are sick. They're twisted. It's basically hanging somebody because they may have done something wrong. Usually it was done by a mob. Usually you were not given a trial. Rough estimates place the number of African Americans lynched in the South between 3,000 and 4,000. This is done towards people who were given no trial and they were falsely accused of a crime. Sometimes it may be for a minor offense, such as testifying against a white person. And so if they felt you did something wrong, the mob might say you're guilty and hang you from a tree and kill you on the spot. No justice, no trial, none of that. And when you look at the statistics for lynchings, there's no comparisons. You may have a state that has 50 white people that are lynched and hung to death, and they'll have 600 African Americans. African Americans were in danger because if they were seen as guilty by the public, a lot of times it might mean that they were killed. And it's pretty sick to look at, but you can see here, they sometimes attracted hundreds of people, as we saw in this picture. But even sadder than that, sometimes they're sold as postcards. People would buy postcards that show African Americans being hung. And on these postcards, they'll write down, hey, we went to the beach or we had a picnic this weekend. How are you doing? It's just sick and twisted, to say the least. And so in a lot of southern states, African Americans, they want to get out. And this is a major push factor because they're scared for their lives. They could die because they're accused of a crime that they didn't do. And so these are your push factors. And altogether, it leads to the Great Migration. And what you're going to see is that in the early 1900s, most African Americans live here in what was the Cotton Belt of the South. And a lot of them are going to start moving north to all these different cities like a Milwaukee, a Chicago, a Detroit, a New York, because of a lot of different pull factors, things that look good up north that are drawing them in. And so in 1910, 90% of African Americans lived in the South and 75% lived on farms. In World War I, 500,000 African Americans move up north. In the 1920s, 800,000 African Americans move up north. And there's a major shift too. A lot are living in the South and rural areas, and now they're going to move to the north to cities. And so that's why even today you see that there's higher African American populations in the cities themselves. It started with this Great Migration. So a lot of the documents you're going to look at in the future here are going to look at Newark, New Jersey. Newark was a big industrial city. It had a lot of boat building properties there. And so there's a lot of opportunities for jobs. And so that's what you're going to look at. And you can see here the African American the population in general, between 1870 and 1920 over quadruples. And when we look at the African American population between 1870 and 1920, it goes up about, 800+%. So a lot of African Americans moving into that area. So the big question is, why do they move to Newark? What are the pull factors that draw them into Newark? And I'm going to give you 4 documents to look at. Take a look at those documents and try to figure out, why is this such an enticing city to live in? So that's what we've got. We can go from there. If you have any questions, you can always email me, contact me in some way, and I can help you out as need be. Have a great day.